All right, thank you everybody for joining us. Welcome to a Korbel School webinar on Beyond the Fall, Kabul 3 years later, or Afghanistan 3 years later, after the return of the Taliban government to power and the withdrawal of U.S. forces and allied forces from the region. Before we start on any panel on Afghanistan, I should just say, because there may be folks who have family there, I hope no one's family was affected by the flooding that occurred recently. So I hope everyone is safe and everyone's family as well. My name is Griffith. I work here at the Korbel School. I am currently the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, means basically I'm the Vice Principal. But before I was the Vice Principal, I was the Director of the National Security Program. And so issues regarding U.S. Policy in the Middle East, particularly from a military and security standpoint, are kind of my bailiwick. But we are not here to listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. We are here to listen to three outstanding panelists. Before we do that, I want to thank the organizer of this panel, who is also not me, Shoaib Maher, who is a student here, who has put this group together for us all, and we greatly benefited. Shoaib, I really appreciate all your efforts in this regard, so thank you very much. In no particular order other than the way they appeared on the flyer, allow me to do some introductions, and then I'm going to ask 3 or 4 questions to kind of get us started and frame out the conversation of all 3 panelists, at which point I would invite you to start putting your questions in the Q&A button, and I will then pick some. I won't get to all. If some of them are the same, I may do a little merging, but we'll just have a conversation until about 8:15, depending on audience interest. Excuse me. Here it's 12, well, 1 o'clock, 1:15. One of our panelists has to go around 8 o'clock because she's a little later in the evening than the rest of us. So we'll try to keep track of time. So again, in no particular order, and again, with great thanks for being here, we have Nishank Motwani, who is currently Senior Defense Analyst at Australia's Strategic Policy Institute, as well as an Edward S. Mason Fellow at the Kennedy School. So thank you very much. We have, I'm going to make sure I get this right, Fereshta Abbasi, who's a researcher at the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch, as well as adjunct faculty at American University of Afghanistan. And Haroun Rahimi, who is an associate professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan and an affiliate with the program in Islamic law at Harvard Law School. So we have 3 very, very qualified people, both personally and professionally, to talk about all things Afghanistan. And so my first question to the group, and probably the only backward-looking question I intend to ask, but it is framed as 3 years later, is 3 years later, if you had to pick a factor or a primary driver or a primary reason for why the Taliban was able to reestablish control of Kabul and surrounding and in Afghanistan as a whole so quickly, where would you start that conversation? Would it be U.S. policy failures? Would it be Afghan national government issues? Would it be legitimacy challenges? The floor is yours, but I'm interested in what each of you would pick as the primary driver as to why we are here where we are.
I will take a stab at it and let others join in. Obviously, there's a long menu, and things like the failure like this doesn't happen due to a single factor, as I think all can acknowledge. I would say, for me, the biggest issue was that the entire political structure, security structure, was built around the U.S. presence. There was really no plan for the day after. And it was due to the failures of the Afghan political leaders, as well as the United States, because the United States also had very much inserted itself in the political life, security apparatus of the Afghan state. As you know, given your security background, the entire security operation was built in a way that was dependent on intelligence, contractors, and everything that flew from the U.S. presence in the country. And once that central piece was removed, there was really no way to keep everything in place. I would say that's number 1 reason.
I can go next. So, I mean, the moment you were telling the question, I mean, for me, it took me back to February 2020, when the US signed the agreement with the Taliban. It's being known as the peace agreement. It never was the peace agreement. It was an agreement that was signed between the US government and the Taliban to maintain, or I mean, to secure the national interest of the US. There was no actually mention of the situation in Afghanistan. I mean, I'm not going to go into details of what exactly the agreement said. The whole idea of the agreement was for the US to withdraw, and then in return for the Taliban to make sure that no one from the geography of Afghanistan would ever, put the national interests of the US in danger. There was no red line in terms of human rights, women's rights. I was back in Afghanistan at the time, and I remember that the civil society had working groups. We were trying to put pressure on the US and those who were engaging with the Taliban to put some red lines in terms of I remember that at the time, I mean, for example, the right to education for children was something that we were trying to put some red lines, but that was not the case. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because that I know one way or another way US was supposed to leave Afghanistan one day, but what it did at the time was that the Taliban announced victory right after signing that agreement, and it gave them that power. Right after the agreement, they were in a more stronger legitimate position than the Afghan government, because then the Afghan government was totally excluded from any of these talks. So I think that was something that gave the Taliban voice and energy to be more active. And then you see that right after, it took another year or so, but they started taking over some districts and then provinces, and then finally Afghanistan, the whole Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. I think just to build on both those points, I think the Doha Agreement itself was cataclysmic to the entire enterprise of the state of Afghanistan's survival. I was also in Kabul at that point when that agreement was being hammered out, before that, and when it was released. The 4 points that I would say were absolutely detrimental to the entire survival of the enterprise of Afghanistan, as in from a foreign standpoint, was number one, that the agreement provided legitimacy to the Taliban and diminished the legitimacy of the Afghan state. Because it made it look like that the Taliban were government in waiting, and that they were in exile and waiting to get back to power. Secondly, the Afghan government was strong-armed to releasing over 5,000 Taliban prisoners, many of whom went back into the battlefield. The military impact that had in the security side was that it really reduced people's morale to fight. And as the capability grid from the US side began to shrink, which had already diminished quite considerably, because at that point we had about 2,500 American soldiers, but that allowed for over 10,000 NATO forces to be deployed in the country, as well as over 26,000 contractors that kept the entire war machinery afloat. So as those capabilities began to diminish, what it did was that it really sapped the morale of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, who had been taking the lead in fighting from 1st Jan 2015, which is when Operation Resolute Support commenced. So the combination of these factors, where a government that was quickly losing legitimacy, was not a signatory to the Doha Agreement, and the Doha Agreement itself spelled out a firm withdrawal date. And at that point, it meant that the Afghan government had no leverage whatsoever over the Taliban, because it incentivized the Taliban to continue precipitating the withdrawal of the American forces and not coming into any negotiations in good faith, because they already got what they wanted. So as Fereshta said, they were celebrating and had declared victory because they got all of their points delivered to them even before there was any conducive atmosphere to talk about next steps. So in their minds, they were waiting for the days to return to power. And we saw that happen in a span of 9 days when province after province collapsed. It wasn't due to a military victory that these provinces collapsed. It was due to the psychological impact. And we have seen that previously historically in Afghanistan as well, with the Soviets coming in and then withdrawing. It wasn't due to the military side of it. It was rather people wagering what's going to guarantee our survival. Backing a government that's in its final days, or do we side with the new powers to guarantee our own survival?
Thank you. So building on that, moving forward-ish in time, and we'll get to the present hopefully by my last question. So in prepping for this, and anyone who pays sort of cursory attention to Afghanistan, not to the level the three of you do, you can find reports of post-fall Taliban government being slightly more professional or slightly more less strident. You can also find lots of reports that they have returned to exactly the government they were beforehand. For the casual observer who knows the Taliban's back in power and knows the Taliban's historical position on things like women's education, freedom of movement, their economic policies, is this government any different? Is this government an effort to be more representative of Afghanis, or do we have the same old Taliban with all the same old consequences for the Afghan citizens?
I'll go again, just to
Well, we seem to have a
maintain.
nice order established. And it's
I
not really-
know.
so we'll just do it that way if you don't mind.
I mean, on some levels, the situation on the ground is very different, and it doesn't have to be due to the change in Taliban. The Afghanistan of 2021, when Taliban took over, was very different than Afghanistan of the 90s. There were working institutions. There was a bureaucracy in place. There was a cadre of young Afghans. Many of them chose to leave the country, but still many stuck around. The education system over the past 20 years has produced not only a lot of graduates, but a deep-seated desire for both men and women and boys and girls of Afghanistan to continue to participate in public life. So faced with that, I think it was just a matter of practicality that Taliban could not return to the same mode of a state-society relationship that they had assumed in the 90s. But generally, if you look at the trend, is that the Taliban, at least at the core center of power within the emirate, wishes to return to the same contours of governance and a state-society relationship that they established in the 90s. Some of the major signature policies that have been widely criticized are the policies from the 90s, like the ban on girls' education. Even though in the 90s it was a complete ban, this time around is beyond primary level. But it speaks of the same desire to return women to the household and reduce their public role. The ban on women working for NGOs, same as the 90s. The ban on the woman basically traveling alone, the choice of clothing and all of that are repeats of the 90s. Despite all of that, if you go on the streets of Kabul and Herat, and I was in the country in December, you would see that Afghanistan hasn't returned to the 90s. Even despite the Taliban wishes, despite the many edicts, still people show up in streets and try to live their lives according to their own preferences and wishes. And Taliban have used the levers of power that they have to push against this. For example, they banned public places where the government has control. They have instructed schools and businesses to not allow women in, like basically what the government controls. But they haven't gone so far as to use the overly used force on the streets to enforce some of these edicts against a woman and Afghans in general. And it's not, I wouldn't credit this to the Taliban change in Taliban attitude per se, even though there are some in the movements who may prefer a different approach than the 90s. I would more credit it to the backlash they would face if they had gone that extreme. But in terms of trends, and if looking at where we are headed, we are seeing more shrinkage and the kind of the restrictions being increasing and the enforcement becoming much more forceful. So I would say Afghanistan have changed. Taliban have realized that to a certain extent have they adapted. But in terms of the ultimate blueprints of what they would like Afghanistan to look like, I think the core leadership of the movement has similar views about where they want to end up.
I think Haroun captured it very well about, the way that the Taliban edicts are coming and the backlash and the resistance that is still in Afghanistan. I mean, it might be a very strong statement from me, but I think Taliban in the 90s and Taliban this time, in a comparison, I think they're worst this time. And the reason is because that, I mean, one of the things that I have always heard, because I was not in Afghanistan during the first Taliban takeover, and I have watched movies, I have spoken to my mom who has experience of living at the time. And I mean, the experience that I have is from what I have heard and watched or read about the first Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. But one of the things, for example, I mean, I think the way that the society has changed and has, evolved over time, the Taliban are not the Taliban of the 90s as well. They were very good. I mean, for example, they're really good in using social media. They're really good in denying doing things. I mean, for example, if you ask the Taliban, or if you try to hold them accountable for ban on education, they would never deny that. They're proud actually to say. I mean, you don't need to do, I mean, lots of research and to get into document that, because they publicly announce it and they say women are not allowed. But if they detain a journalist, if they detain a female protester, that's where the whole technique comes from. What I have heard from the 90s is that, yes, there were all these restrictions, but at the same time, there was a respect for women. So either those cases haven't been documented or I'm not aware of, or I mean, a lot of people may have not been spoken about. But the case of sexual harassment of what we hear, what is happening in the Taliban detention, I mean, in the recent weeks, in the past few weeks, some of the female protesters have started sharing their experiences about sexual harassment in the Taliban detention, about some of them being raped and all of those. I think this is even worse. And some of them speak about the fact that they have been filmed while being raped by a group of Taliban members. And I think that's one of the reasons that they're speaking of, because they're worried that these videos may come out to the social media one or another day. So I would say that the way that the society has evolved, the Taliban has learned new techniques as well. I mean, they're now forcing people. I mean, the first time that they detained a vlogger from Kabul, they forced him to, on camera, to confess that he's being paid by the West to promote immorality. These are the kind of new things that is coming, I would say, with these Taliban. And I mean, and when we say Taliban, I think what we imagine is always a person who's a long beard and I mean has a turban. It's not always the case. I mean, some of them are very educated. Some of them have actually been educated in the Western institution. Some of them have lived abroad. They speak English very well. They know the language. They know the language of NGOs and things. So they know how to communicate. They know how this world works. And I would say that in that sense, to some extent, they know how to play with these words as well.
Thank you. If I may just add to those two points, is that the Taliban have been successful in terms of adapting to the new environment, and that's with the clinical focus of retaining the substance of what they do. And what I mean by that is that ideologically, they are more strident than before. And what they are aiming to do is to systematically expunge gradually Western influences. The easy targets, of course, are in education, employment, and the delivery of services. And they've been very adept at using Western language, particularly those coming out of NGOs, human rights domain, as a way to disarm criticism, because they can speak in a language that others understand about human rights, about delivery of services, and they do so in a convincing manner. So this is being orchestrated at quite a strategic level, because they have studied the approach of the West over the last 20 plus years, and as a way to minimize or mitigate against significant backlash, they're able to use similar language and similar narratives as a way to divert attention away, as well as to cause a little bit of confusion. This is your classical psychological operations that they're dealing in. And they did it before they took over the country. And now that they have seized control of the country and all the different organs of the state, they're far more compelling in their ability to propagate their messaging. So ideologically, they have not changed. They're more strident. politically, it's a single party, single entity where there's no space for dissent or having any other form of discourse. And in terms of strategically speaking, you can read the UN reports that come out about the terrorist environment that the country has become a host to. There's over 20 different terrorist organizations that are in the country, and many of whom have sworn allegiance to the Taliban. Now, I think one of the bigger questions that comes out is what comes next. Ideologically, politically, these groups are not known to be disarming themselves. It's about what is their mission next. And the failure of the West to stay the course in Afghanistan and for the Taliban to come back has given them oxygen, and it's been a lightning bolt to these organizations because they feel ideologically that it was their strident ideology that delivered them victory. And what comes next is far beyond the geographical borders of Afghanistan. So this is a space we have to continue to watch. It is by no means a static situation. It is a dynamic one, and it's provided them a lot of breathing room to regroup, rearm, and retrain themselves to figure out where they go next. And when we perhaps get to a discussion on the regional implications of the Taliban's return to power, we can talk about it in greater detail.
You're muted. You're
Oh,
muted.
no, I said I'm done. Over to Louis.
No. Sorry. What I was going to say is I'm going to give you a warning. I'm going to come to you first because you started answering my next question. And so you're doing a great job in the third spot, but I'll let you go first on this one since you started down this road. And then we'll just work in reverse order as we did last time. My question was actually going to be that from a strategic analyst standpoint, one thing you generally know about Afghanistan since Americans began paying attention is it is a fractured body politic. There are lots of different terms and labels for it. I don't want to start, clans and I don't want to start using that terminology when it's not always appropriate. But there are certainly different groups in Afghanistan who have different levels of loyalty to any given central government and different levels of central government ability to impose themselves. Haroun had said something about the potential backlash and a more sophisticated populace. You've just mentioned that there are groups out there that might be cooperating with the Taliban, but aren't necessarily think of themselves as the Taliban. Since you started down that road, let me just give you some room to continue to talk about internal political fractionalization or dynamics that might be emerging, because clearly you've all said the Taliban would like to reestablish very tight control over Afghanistan. The question is, are they going to be able to do that?
Thank you, Louis. And I have to say, as a caveat, I'm an outside observer now. I haven't been back since for a few years. So a lot of the what I'm thinking about is obviously as an outsider, and I'm not privy to those conversations as I was earlier on. So from a purely analytical standpoint, I think the three things that really jump out to me is one about their internal cohesion. Secondly is about how they've been able to reestablish control. And third is about the constellation of different terrorist organizations that are operational and active in Afghanistan. So the first one about group cohesion itself, I don't think that came as a surprise to those of us who actually follow the Taliban, because they have had a central overarching narrative and a political structure as fluid as it is and as opaque as it seems sometimes, because it is difficult to map out who is where within the organization, what are the different groupings, what are the different factions. Work has been done on this matter, but I don't think it's possible to say with any significant degree of authority that this is what the Taliban apparatus looks like. It's hard to do so, and to then track its ideological imperators and so on. But in terms of the centrality of the organization and how they've been able to have that cohesive glue to stay the course, it goes to show that the power of their old guard and how that old guard from the 90s has been critical to ensuring that the group itself as the Taliban stays cohesive, and they have been able to put in place the people that they regard as loyal to project their power. And I think one of those instances where that stands to to watch is around taxation collection. Of course, context being the economy is in free fall, and so the limited sources of revenue where they're able to channel any money from is in the border checkpoints and the land ports. And from those positions, you would have initially in 2021, with all the different groups that came under the broader Taliban umbrella and who did the brunt of the fighting, one would have assumed that commanders who did the fighting, who came from different political, tribal, ethnic backgrounds, those who were instrumental in the Taliban's victory would be rewarded with lucrative projects or lucrative postings. That actually hasn't happened. I'm not saying it hasn't happened in some instances, but that reward structure, incentive structure hasn't actually carried out the way it ought to have in terms of, if you're just looking at cost benefits in that terms. So what they've resorted to is installing people that they know who are loyal, who are from the old guard, as a way to provide that glue over the country. So it's again very centralized. And Afghanistan, there's been a lot of debate about the political notion of centralization versus decentralization of power. They have gone about the model of centralizing power as opposed to devolving power. So that's the first point I would make. The second point on which I can mold it into one is about the different terrorist organizations that are transnational in reach, that have overarching objectives beyond Afghanistan, and the way in which that they're harnessing ideology as a way to propagate their larger strategic objectives. Now, as of now, where we are, we haven't seen significant attacks take place outside of the country. But in my conversations with people that I was familiar with who were in Central Asian governments back in the day and who are still currently in government, they're extremely concerned. This is an incubator of extremist ideology, and like I said earlier, it has given it's been a lightning bolt to these organizations who are thinking about, we're going to bide our time and we're going to act later on. It's not playing out as per our timeline. We're thinking about it in terms of when would they act. They have a longer game in motion, and to think that they're going to go about some DDR process where they're going to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate, I mean, that is wishful thinking, to be honest. Where these groups become important for the Taliban is in terms of legitimacy. Now, it's legitimacy according to their terms. They're not seeking external legitimacy, and this is a point I've made back when I was in Kabul and follow on since then, is that external legitimacy is a point that it's a nice to have, as in they would like international recognition, but it's not a must have. It is much more important for them to consolidate their control and to be true to their own ideology. And if they get Western recognition or Chinese recognition, it's nice, it's good, it'll help them out. But that's not what their modus operandi is. And these groups play a role in helping them consolidate that control, not necessarily through armed force, although that is certainly the case in parts of the country, but it's about providing them with that ideological imprimatur to consolidate that control and to really expand their presence and propagating that fear. So I'll stop there because I'm sure Fereshta and Haroun have a lot more to say. Thank you.
Others?
First, do you want to come in? If you're going to reverse order, I'll speak last.
Okay, I mean, this is not a question that I have any expertise on, but I'm just speaking of my own observations of the Taliban takeover since, August 2021, which is like we're nearly there. August this year will be 3 years that they're in effective control of the country. So, I mean, the Taliban have taken over Afghanistan. That's correct. Do they have the capacity to govern and actually build a structure there? That's the question. I don't really think so. I mean, Haroun earlier mentioned that when the Taliban took over this time, there were some established institutions in the country. So some of the civil servants that are still operating and delivering service are actually the former civil servants. So it's not as if the Taliban took over and they have taken and they have replaced everyone. Maybe the head of the departments, but some technical people are people who was always used to work on those ministries. I remember I watched a media interview from the head of passport department for Kabul, and he was a Talib commander. And the journalist was asking that how different it is for you working now. How do you feel? You don't need to fight anymore. You're just here and signing papers. And for him, it was difficult. He said it was easier for us to fight on the battle. Here, I need to keep track of everything. I need to have a list. I need to know what I'm signing or what I'm not. So. I mean, they don't have the experience of governing, right? They've been good in fighting on the ground, but running a country needs expertise, and that's a question whether the Taliban have that or not, or to what extent they can actually attract expertise to bring on board with them. If you look at the Taliban cabinet, most of them are a religious leader. Most of them are mullahs. They're not necessarily experts in their own fields, which is another issue. So, I mean, one of the things that we could see some, I would say, some episodes of fraction within the Taliban, all the way top, I mean, to the leadership, was when the ban on education announced. I remember that Sirajuddin Haqqani, which is a very strong and powerful individual within the Taliban leadership, tweeted something about it. And imagine a person as strong as Haqqani tweeting something and trying to show that he's not on board with this. He doesn't agree necessarily that there needs to be a ban on education for women. That was one of the things. And we have had this, I mean, to the level of deputy ministers. Some of them have spoken about the fact that, I mean, they don't necessarily agree that there needs to be a ban. But I think one of the reasons that the Taliban are actually putting all these restrictions on women is because they're trying to make sure that their forces are staying together and they're cohesive. They don't want to lose anyone, especially their soldiers. I mean, those people who actually fought for them, the soldiers who are not necessarily educated, and for the past 20 years, they have fought for to build an Islamic emirate. That's what the Taliban have always said. They want an Islamic emirate, even during the negotiations and after the taking over the country as well. It would be very difficult for them to let all these restrictions go now. They don't want, it's very difficult for them to keep everyone because they fought for something and now they cannot go back in terms of that, I would say. I mean, again, speaking of observation, there has been some clashes between the Taliban in Badakhshan recently. I mean, we know that, the Taliban, the majority of most of the Taliban are Pashtuns, but there are members from other ethnicities as well who are fighting. And there has been fractions and clashes between Taliban who are not, non-Pashtun Talibans and Pashtun Taliban. So we had seen that, I think, maybe once in the case of Panjshir, but also in Badakhshan, who's been, recently there has been clashes for a week or so. So, they are trying to stay together, but the winning point for them is that whatever Amir al-Mu'mineen says is what they're going to follow. Even after the whole thing when over the ban on education came, there was an announcement from the spokesperson of the Taliban who said that we will follow whatever Amir al-Mu'mineen says. And because he's at the center of the leadership and whatever he says needs to be implemented, I think that's where the winning point is. Otherwise, it's very difficult to say that the Taliban are a centralized structure or centralized government, because even when you speak to people or the NGOs who are still operating inside Afghanistan, you would see that different regional leaders take different stance. So in terms of, ban on, there is a ban on employment for women, but it really depends. Women in Uruzgan might not be able to work, but women in Herat may. So that's the thing. There has been some, it's not a lift on the ban, but some organizations have managed ways to negotiate with the local level Taliban officials there. So again, the edicts and everything that comes from the top leadership, the implementation when it reaches to the ground is quite different. And that shows that it really depends to what extent that the regional leader is, again, difficult to use this word for the Taliban, but more open to either implement or not implement that specific edict, or to what extent they actually want to implement that restrictions in that specific area or in that province.
So just very brief thoughts on the three themes that have been highlighted so far. In terms of internal cohesion, there are differences within the movement, but so far they have remained cohesive, and the internal mechanisms to resolve internal disagreements have functioned more or less effectively so far. Will this continue to be the case? Nobody knows. And one of the reasons that this internal mechanisms of handling disagreement works is because of the fact that there is a sense of duty, loyalty, grounded in ideology towards the supreme leader, but also the supreme leader does engage in consultation and negotiation and compromise with different Taliban constituencies. The bottom line is when the movement, and it's consistent throughout their history, when the movement wants to deviate from or wishes to deviate from established ideological tenets of its of the Taliban, there has to be consensus, and that gives a minority, especially the old guard, or people who are more ideologically rigid, a kind of veto. I think there are a lot of in the movement that would like to see more pragmatism, more. We said how they've adapted to a certain degree on the matters of governance, but some would like to see a little bit more adaptivity when it comes even to social issues. But I think the movement will not be able to change its core policies without reaching internal consensus. Otherwise, it would risk further fragmentation, and that gives basically those who hold strong views that women should not go to school, women should not be in public, kind of a veto power, and that's those two objectives of keeping internal cohesion and adapting to the changed environment seem to be in tension. The second issue with regard to different groups in the country, I would just highlight that it also seems to be, I mean, you have to divide groups in, there are groups who have friendly relationship with the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda and TTP, who receive mutual support from the Taliban. And they, Taliban, have had very tense relationship with Pakistan, and it's one of the questions I think in the chat, due to their close relationship with the TTP. And Al-Qaeda so far has refrained from putting Taliban in a position where they would have to also make a hard choice whether they would stick with the Al-Qaeda or they would openly or they would stay with Al-Qaeda or to openly take actions against them. TTP basically put Taliban in that position when the peace negotiation with the Pakistan and TTP failed, so they chose TTP. With regard to Al-Qaeda, given that Al-Qaeda has been more or less dormant, Taliban didn't have to go that far, but things could change. If God forbid there's a major attack in a Western capital, there will be much more demand from the Taliban. I mean, it's traced back to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Taliban would have to do something, or they would just face the scenarios of the 90s. Maybe not a full-scale invasion, but a lot more heat will be brought on them. And I think they have a desire to keep those groups in sorts of management and control, so at least they don't create and cause direct problems for the movement. But they have to counterbalance that against the loyalty they feel to these groups and the loyalty their fighters feel to this group, and don't come across as betraying the cause that many have helped them advance in the country. And lastly, with regard to resistance to the Taliban from other elements, yes, there are many instances, in smaller scale instances, over local matters when the disputes do arise. Taliban have so far used very much heavy-handed violence as a way to deal with them. They have remained contained so far, but Afghanistan is a land of a lot of unpredictable movements. There is no reason not to believe that these could spread, and in Taliban, in their rush to answer with a lot of violence, could actually cause them to spread. But so far, they have been able to contain them. And it's partly because these are very localized grievances. Like in other places, it was the one recently was over the destruction of Old Poppy, and the fact that some Taliban officials from Kandahar were sent to rule over Badakhshan, and people feel that their own local leaders are being disregarded or ignored. So they're very localized, and they can be dealt with locally. But if they spread around and they give rise to a sense of shared form of objection to the movement, and there is some organization connecting all these together, things could become serious enough for the Taliban to face some sort of serious challenge in the country. They haven't yet.
Excellent. So fantastic. I'm going to hold on to my fourth question because as Haroun referenced, we have a very good question in the chat. We might as well go ahead and start with that. So other folks want to put their questions in the Q&A section. Let's do that. The question, and Haroun, if you want to go first because you referenced it already, started it, was how are relations between Pakistan and Taliban Afghanistan today?
They are at the lowest point. I mean, Taliban and Pakistan, and we are talking about we have to kind of unpack what we mean by Pakistan. There are, if you're talking about the Pakistani army and Pakistani establishment, the relationship is at its lowest. Pakistan has used force. There are border issues that continue to happen in Afghanistan. Both Taliban have accused Pakistan of backing ISKP, and Pakistan has accused Taliban of supporting TTP as it escalates its attacks on Pakistani soil. Pakistan has used sanctions, has used kinetic force against targets in Afghanistan. So the relationships are at its lowest. But the movement has a long history with a lot of constituencies within the Pakistan. The Pakistan has used the ulama establishment in Pakistan as a way to mediate with the Taliban, because I don't think Pakistan would like to see this relationship deteriorates even further. And Taliban have also relied on the relationships they have built with different groups within the Pakistan over the course of insurgency as a way to mitigate and try to ameliorate some of the tensions. But the tensions are not going anywhere because, as I indicated earlier, Taliban are unwilling to take serious actions against the TTP, that is the Tehrik-e-Taliban of Pakistan, to the satisfaction of Pakistan establishment. They have done some. The Ministry of Interior said they have arrested somebody. A number of people, 100 plus TTP officials, for violating basically the rules that Taliban put on them while they are in Afghan territory. They have even offered to the Pakistanis that they would relocate some of the TTP away from the Pakistani borders. They've also, the Taliban Supreme Leader has issued a fatwa saying that no Afghan, at least, Taliban should engage in jihad in Pakistan. But even all these together haven't been enough to reduce the capacity of TTP to conduct attacks inside the Pakistan, and Pakistan establishment has been unsatisfied, maybe question the sincerity, or has been unsatisfied with the effect that these have generated. Taliban, on the other hand, they often use the same playbook that Pakistan did when they were accused of supporting then Afghan Taliban inside their territories. The Afghan Taliban now basically are saying that we don't control the border. It is happening within the Pakistani territory. It is the responsibility of Pakistani security to take care of their own borders and their own internal security. And they urge the Pakistani state to negotiate with the TTP to find a non-military solution to the conflict as a way to spare them this impossible choice they feel they're put in to choose between the TTP and maybe alienate a lot of their supports in the tribal areas among some Afghan tribes and Pashtun tribes, and also risk losing fighters to more extreme elements that are active in the region, or just face a direct clash with Pakistan. So yes, the dynamics that are at play haven't eased, and these dynamics have pushed both parties towards a very negative kind of outcome. But I don't see any resolution on the horizon that could change the underlying dynamics. Both parties seem pretty entrenched in the positions they have taken on these issues, despite their wishes to mitigate.
Others? All right. No, silence is rapture. Just means we've answered all questions. All right, we have a question here. Here we go. How do you envision the roles and movements of former leaders, including warlords, and the youth contributing to Afghans' long-term development? Where is Afghan headed in a developmental, improving the prosperity of its citizens sort of sense?
I'll have a go at that. I think one of the biggest challenges the fragmented and remnants of the Afghan government, as they are obviously spread all around the globe, is that there's a crisis of legitimacy. There's also a huge challenge that they face, as in terms of, even if that is something that they're attempting to do, I don't know, of trying to have one figurehead or several figureheads as of saying that we are the representative of the former Afghan government. And there are a variety of reasons for that, corruption being one of them. Secondly, having the general sense being that they abandoned the country, with the senior leadership, including President Ghani, escaping as the country was folding. So there is that crisis of legitimacy, and it's something that they probably can't come back from. What this means is that there's a huge vacuum in place, which has given the Taliban significant hold to push out its narrative. Now, thankfully, over the last 20 years and us knowing about the Taliban, we should analyze their actions as opposed to their words. And it's clear in terms of how they're seeking to recreate and resurrect the Islamic Emirate and carry out their edicts, as we've talked about before. What this also does, though, however, is that, as in the space of the vacuum, it has created a lot of potential opportunities for other people to come up and, if not at a political level, but at a developmental level, to try and lead the charge in terms of challenging narratives of, oh, Afghanistan was never primed for democracy. Oh, we didn't go there for promoting women's rights and education. Those are false narratives that are overly simplistic. So although people who are coming out and speaking against those narratives have they're not necessarily in Afghanistan, in the country, and it's difficult for them to make a substantive change on the ground, given that they're overseas. What they are able to do, however, is to challenge these narratives from taking hold within Western democratic countries, particularly who have kind of given up and just said, no, it was all for a lost cause and there was nothing going for it in any case. So I think the tremendous amount of investments that have been made in education over the last 20 years, and the succession of students coming out into the West and studying, and many of them being who are now here displaced and trying to rebuild their lives, is to challenge those narratives from taking place. And I think that's very critical, because it means that they can continue lobbying, whether it's members of Congress, the Senate, in the United States and other countries, as a way not to soften their stance on the Taliban, as a way to allow for to put pressure on programs such as the SIV, Special Immigration Visa programs, to expand the capacity, to bring more people in, to lobby on behalf of people who are in the country regarding working rights and so on. And so that, I think there are opportunities that are there, but it's still fairly, I mean, it's not even been 3 years. It's still a very new environment. And I think there could be instances where people come up and do take the charge in terms of for development issues. But for what I said earlier on, in terms of the crisis of legitimacy at a political level, it would be very difficult from any person from the previous government to come out and to rally individuals around them. I'll stop there.
I can go next. I mean, I think in terms of where Afghanistan is headed, it's very difficult, I mean, to stay optimistic with the current situation. And I mean, one of the things they believe for people to change anything on the ground in Afghanistan is, I think this change might be very slow. It may take lots of time, but it definitely will happen. It needs to happen from inside Afghanistan. As we discussed about it, that people are not, Afghanistan is not Afghanistan in the 90s. People have changed. People have seen a different world. Those girls who are not allowed to go to school right now in Afghanistan, some of them were grade 11, so some of them were about to get graduated from the school, some of them were about to go to university. We have, I mean, we have people in Afghanistan right now who knows that how things work, how world looks beyond what they're leaving, or the box that they're leaving right now. I believe that those women will raise their children different. And again, it's going to be a very slow change, but I think that's what needs to happen in Afghanistan. And this time, people in Afghanistan will lead that. We, at least the past 20 years, have proved to us that it's impossible to change a country from outside. And again, I agree that if we believe that the notion of women's rights came with the US presence in Afghanistan, it's very naive to think like that. But when it comes to the former government, when it comes to the warlords, I mean, first of all, most of these warlords are accused of, committing war crimes. Their human rights, their records in terms of human rights is very, very problematic. And at the same time, it's not as if these people will take over and things will change much. Afghanistan ranked to be one of the worst country to be a woman in before the Taliban takeover, even before the Taliban takeover. What is happening in Afghanistan right now, I would say, is a madness. It's crazy to see that. The whole restrictions around women's rights in Afghanistan. But let's imagine a day that one of the former warlords comes and takes over Afghanistan. Will it change anything for women's rights? As a woman from Afghanistan, I don't really think so. I think this time it's going to be different, and that will take a bit of time. I'm now speaking of 10 or 20 years, and it's very difficult to stay hopeful in that sense. But I believe on those women who are still protesting from inside Afghanistan. I believe on those women who are still resisting from inside Afghanistan, and I believe that they will build the Afghanistan they deserve to live in.
I mean, it's a very difficult problem, to state the obvious. Everyone agrees that there needs to be a political process. The UN appointed a special reporter who looked at the Afghan situation and basically produced a report. And the report, one of the main tenets of the report is that there needs to be a political process. U.S. Department of State has from 2023 has a country kind of policy on Afghanistan, and they also emphasize the need for a political process. But the issue is how you can actually bring the elements of Afghan society that are not Taliban or actively opposed to Taliban, and how to include them in the process. In a situation where Taliban have basically closed down all avenues for political participation within the country. Many have defaulted to use the actors that are known internationally as a part of the process, but they have soon realized that those actors have lost legitimacy in the eyes of the people in Afghanistan. So any genuine inclusive process, to take place, you would have to find a way to include the new generation of leaders that are rooted in the country, and as Fereshta said, are there to make the country work for them as they are living there, and have some level of basically popularity amongst different non-Taliban factions in the country. But this has to happen despite the fact that anyone who engages in any form of political activity that is even slightly threatening to the movement, Taliban would cramp down on it and push the person out or arrest them. That's one major hurdle to get over, and it would often honestly require Taliban to change their attitude towards some form of political participation within the country, which I don't see coming. In absence of that, engaging the repeated and kind of tried actors, as Fereshta said, who have a very bad track record, could give an appearance that something is happening, but I don't think it's going to move the ball forward at all.
Okay, excellent. I wanna say now before we get to the next question, and I want to thank her while we still have her. At some point, Fereshta is going to have to step off because we're keeping her up late in a very different time zone. So that's not a technical glitch. And I just want to thank you now. You can answer the next question, but wherever you need to go, we totally understand. And thank you for being with us. Take 2 or 3 more. I've got 2 here that I'm going to sort of combine and split slightly differently, but I think they're the same sort of question. One relates to the idea of the international community and or the United States, instead of rejecting the Taliban government and refusing to deal with it, maybe taking a more collaborative approach or changing its overall perspective to be more collaborative with Afghanis, if not the government itself. So we have sort of a theme of questions here about the ability of the international community, the United States, the development community, the rights community to engage maybe with the Taliban or with Afghans around the Taliban that I'd love to get your thoughts on. And then the second part of the question is, when do the consequences, sort of an economic, socioeconomic question, when do the consequences of these particular decisions to curtail education, particularly for women and girls, for economic retrenchment, for all the sorts of things that classic liberal scholars and analysts would say will eventually have meaningful economic and socioeconomic costs? When might we see those, or is that just not an appropriate model for Afghanistan?
I will just shortly speak about my idea, and then I will leave. So, I mean, in terms of engagement, I don't think if anyone is against engagement. I mean, I think it's very important to have a dialogue. It's very important to speak with the Taliban. They are the de facto authority in Afghanistan. They're the one who has effective control all over the country right now. And I mean, to this day, there is no any other, I mean, I would say armed resistance that is any threat to the status quo of the Taliban. That's, I think, we need to accept as a fact. First of all, they are ruling the country. The second thing is about how to engage with the Taliban, I think, is a question that comes there. I mean, there has been lots of call from the local activists, I mean, there's local civil society group and people in exile, as well as, international organizations for supporting the efforts on advocacy, is that principal engagement is very important. We need to have, we need to have benchmarks on what exactly we want to get from this engagement and to what extent these would work. I would say, I mean, I think it's a good moment for the international community to take a pause and rethink of their policies in Afghanistan for the past 2.5 years, to see that those countries who've engaged with the Taliban, those are who are still dealing with the Taliban, to what extent they have received, this positive feedback, or to what extent they really think that this relation is working. I mean, so far, no country has recognized them. No country has no European country, or US or UK has an embassy in Afghanistan. I think most of the embassies have shifted to Doha and they're operating from Qatar, but there has been talks, there has been negotiations ongoing. And on the other side, what makes it, again, very difficult, I think, is that the willingness of the Taliban to engage and to be flexible in terms of what exactly could be achieved, or what change would look like, is another thing. I mean, we're stuck with the appointment of Haroun, might be able to tell more because I need to leave in a few minutes, but we are stuck with the appointment of the UN Special Envoy. The Security Council has just mandated a Special Envoy for Afghanistan, and the Taliban just simply don't want a Special Envoy. The idea was for the Special Envoy to lead and coordinate the political engagement with the Taliban. But I mean, a Special Envoy wouldn't be able to work if the Taliban are not cooperating. And we have been waiting for that, I mean, for a good couple of months, right? So I think that's another thing. It is a very complicated discussion, but I think it is time to set some benchmarks and to rethink of how things could be done. And again, I mean, I don't think if closing the door to engagement, or closing the door for any dialogue or discussion, would change anything for people in Afghanistan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I would very briefly, I would say Taliban would like to decouple their relationship with other countries and international community from domestic policies. They have maintained that they're willing to engage with any country on issues of bilateral interests, but they consider the domestic policies they implement in the country to be beyond the legitimate interest of any foreign actor. So the countries have engaged with Afghanistan basically had the choice of accepting this parameter and then engage with them on issues of bilateral interest and receive. And when they have done so, they find Taliban to be receptive. If you have a specific bilateral issue that touches on the foreign aspects of how Taliban are relating to another country, you may get a kind of a positive reception from the Taliban. If one wishes that these engagements would result in change in domestic policies of the Taliban, I haven't seen any proof that has been successful. So what that means for a country that wishes to engage with the Taliban for the betterment and improvements of lives of Afghans, but at the same time does not want to undermine the the moral stance that people have taken against the Taliban is to just narrow the scope of engagement and try to be very clear as to what is the engagement for and what are the conditions around engagement. As you pointed out, the issues of economy, the humanitarian assistance, and the issues of evacuation of Afghans at risk, those are legitimate issues to engage the Taliban with. And I think Taliban have shown that they are willing to engage on those fronts in a kind of a give and take, quid pro quo situation. But those who sell engagement and normalization or other things as a way that would achieve, as a mean to achieve a change in Taliban when it comes to like core domestic policy of the movements, I don't think it's going to work. And I think trying to could actually play into the hands of the Taliban and basically reaffirm their beliefs that they don't really have to compromise and the world will come to them. I think that's been the general sentiment, that they don't really have to move a lot if they remain steadfast in their core positions, that the world will change the standards and criteria and then maybe find a different narrative, but will continue to basically shift towards everything but formal recognition that hasn't come yet, but that could come as well. So I would say engage in areas that we think would help improve the lives of 40 million people who are living under the Taliban control, but be very clear about what engagement can achieve and what it cannot achieve. And when you engage, have clear boundaries and parameters as to what would be the legitimate kind of a scope for engagement.
And very quickly, just to add, I think Haroun and Fereshta was spot on in terms of defining those areas of where there could be some degree of dialogue that can take place. Politically speaking, to use engagement as a way to bring about political change is just highly unlikely, and frankly, there's no evidence of that. And many of us, including me, have been saying that for years now. Where there is some degree of scope, as what we've seen since the Taliban have returned to power, is the thin presence of foreign embassies that have maintained their presence in the country. So you have India, you have Russia, Iran, China, the Central Asian states, Japan. The EU also has a delegation. And a lot of these points of engagement are not so much around, they're not on the political issues, they're on the technical issues, they're on development issues, so there is in some quarters a more nuanced understanding about where the Taliban can be engaged in, so long as it does not cross over into the political side of things. And that goes to show that for the Taliban, there's a hard red line right there that you can talk to us. We welcome that engagement. We like the photo ops. We like being seen with other people sitting in rooms chatting around. But if you push us on political matters, that's a no-go area. And to determine that you can use non-political matters as an entry point to discuss political matters, I think that is fairly naive when it comes to the Taliban. They have remained very steadfast in their orientation politically, and have shown that there's no political space to attempt to try even changing them on certain things, as whether it's women's education, employment issues, and so on. So we have to be absolutely clear about what is it that we're seeking to achieve, what is that end state in dealing with the Taliban, and almost entirely all of those responses are going to be the non-political domain.
Excellent. We have a question which I will ask here in just a second. I want to put something in front of it first, just because it was in the news recently, and I suspect the audience is aware. So it strikes some of us who may not be paying attention a little surprising, this headline, to see an ISIS terrorist attack in Afghanistan, which is obviously very different than the traditional narrative of which we talked about, actually, or you all talked about very insightfully, about the notion of groups that the Taliban regime has supported and might rebase themselves there if they ever left. Could you give a little context on why at least the most prominent of Islamist militant terrorist, global terrorist organizations, ISIS, apparently feels the need to launch attacks in Afghanistan? That seems a little counterintuitive to those of us not paying close attention. The other question then, which the audience has asked, it's a very sensible one, is there the equivalent forming of a second resistance or a Northern Alliance We talked a little bit about how we don't see it yet, but is there the potential for a formal organized resistance movement domestically in Afghanistan? These are sort of two security related questions. I'll throw them both out there for you gentlemen to chew on.
So with regard to ISKP, they have been active in Afghanistan before the Taliban took over. There is, I mean, you have to realize that it's a very complex landscape of Afghanistan when it comes to these armed movements. People have debated how distinct Taliban and ISKP are. Some of the founding members of ISKP were from the TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan members, the commanders who left that movement and joined at the time burgeoning ISKP in Afghanistan. But over time, the divide between the Taliban and ISKP has widened. And it's it is partly because they see each other as competitive. And when it comes to controlling territory, when it comes to competing for recruitment, when it comes to claiming legitimacy as the sole actor that represents the Islamic governance, Islamic forms of politics in the region and beyond. ISKP has targeted the Taliban over its existence, and Taliban have targeted ISKP and has tried to target its communities that the Taliban feel like could be feeding the ISKP due to ideological leaning or many other factors. ISKP remains the most serious threat to the Taliban today. It has shown that it has capacity to execute complex attacks, even in Kandahar, which is the spiritual capital of the movement. It has targeted high-ranking officials of the Taliban. Taliban have also responded with heavy-handed kind of violence, their own version of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, which is very brutal, but also very comprehensive. In terms of what they are kind of fighting over, it has to be like, you have to think about it as to who is going to be the person controls the resources, territory, and will use Afghanistan. ISKP has obviously broader goals beyond Afghanistan. It wants to use Afghanistan as a part of its kind of a global mission, and it's very apocalyptical in its outlook. Taliban wants to establish a more nationalized version of Islamic governance. So in that sense, their goals are in tension. But they both claim to be representing the true forms of Islamic governance, and in that sense, they are in competition with each other. They are alternatives to each other. Taliban they're much more secured in terms of their connection with the population. They're local, they're indigenous, they are to the land. They come from Afghanistan. ISKP relies on international actors, but also a member of the elements of Afghan communities, but it's not very popular and does not enjoy popular support in the country. The trajectory of where this competition, this tension, this fight is going remains unclear. But that I just wanted to highlight that many countries who engage with the Taliban often engage because they see Taliban as at least as a viable counter-terrorism partner when it comes to containing ISKP, especially since ISKP has broader objectives beyond Afghanistan, whereas Taliban are seen as being much more local in terms of their ambitions, and therefore not as much of a threat to external actors.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. What I would just add to it is that I think historically it's also important to point out that in the lead up to the collapse of the Afghan government, although the two organizations, the Taliban and ISKP, were competing for influence and competing for resources and were clear competitors, there were also areas where they were cooperating. And they were cooperating in areas. I remember one instance, I believe it was in 2019 in Badkhashan province, where the two of them were cooperating in attacking the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces that were deployed there. And what that goes to show is that militarily, they have some degree of overlap and they have a common enemy, And of course, that enemy is gone now because of the withdrawal. But where they could be, and this is just hypothetical, is that somebody asked a question about the National Resistance Front. What could be a viable alternative to the Taliban as things go forward? This is the clear response to that is that we don't know. And what we do know in terms of reality is that the NRF has limited, very limited external support because countries after 20 years of involvement in Afghanistan are quite reluctant and have that war fatigue of wanting to go back in and getting embroiled again. To Haroun's point, which is that they see Western countries see the Taliban to some extent as a viable partner in their common goal of ensuring that ISKP is contained to Afghanistan with the ultimate objective of perhaps defeating them. And they prioritize some degree of cooperation with the Taliban in order to meet that common threat. That being said, it is the NRF may emerge as a common enemy for both of them, and this is purely hypothetical, so I want to stress that. But we haven't seen that occur. In terms of the NRF's own ability to prosecute attacks within the country, it's fairly limited. This is not an insurgency. This is very much a hit and run kind of tactics, your classic guerrilla tactics. But whether that taps into a broader groundswell of support, that is an area that we want to watch because it constitutes many different moving parts. You have intelligence, you have resources, you have safe havens, you have money, there's weapons and ammunition, there's free movement. All of those are different. Those are different parts that are necessary for NRF or any other competitor to take on the Taliban. And what to allow all of those to occur, you need domestic population support. That domestic support is key. And without that, any basis for a counterinsurgency, or whether that's too broad a term, but for NRF to gain more momentum, it would have to build that domestic public support. We haven't seen that happen yet, but it is becoming somewhat more effective in terms of being able to hit the Taliban. It's my reading of it is that at this point it is still considered a manageable threat. It's seen perhaps as an irritant rather than anything more. And that threat level is at a tactical level, not at an operational, and certainly not at a strategic level. So it's fairly well. The Taliban have the confidence, again as an outsider, that in their ability to deal with the threat coming from the NRF. And but there may be a degree of confluence between ISKP and the Taliban as a way to take on NRF, or it could even be the other way around. But this is a spot that we have to continue looking at, and the forward trajectory of it is unknown.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so the next question, which we've kind of alluded to parts of, but I think is well put to ask directly. Countries have various ways of legitimating their domestic rule. One very much is ideational, religious, nationalist, etc. But almost no government can get away with not performing some basic economic functions over time. So the question, which our audience member asked very adroitly, is how important is economic performance, economic development to the Taliban, either in their own thinking or in terms of their future, given the realistic understanding of the state of Afghanistan after decades of war and occupation, etc.
I mean, they do see economy as a major issue. That's why, because most Afghans see the state of economy as a major issue as well. They also see economic activities as a source of revenue, like any other state would, which would translate to autonomy, because that will be a sort of revenue they have control over, as opposed to international assistance that comes with some give and take and strings attached. And at the moment, most of it is channeled through the UN. So both for the purpose of maintaining their autonomy and the survival of the regime, but also as a way to at least appease and reduce the discontent that the population may be feeling, they see economy as an important area for them to focus on. But what can they achieve given their limited capacity for governance, given that Afghanistan, even though as a country is not sanctioned, but as its ruling authority is highly sanctioned, and given that they have the Afghanistan political stability landscape outlook remains very, very uncertain. We all talked about how Taliban don't face an immediate threat, but as I alluded to earlier, it takes one major attack in one major capital of the world that is traced back to some element that is friendly with the Taliban inside Afghanistan to change that completely. So I think if an economic actor is thinking about making long-term investments in the country, they would actually have to play out that scenario. What would happen if there's an attack in capital X? How would the world react? What would happen to my investment in the country? And I don't think anyone, including China, has decided that the country and its ruling authority are can provide that kind of a stability to commit major investments to the country. In absence of major external investments in the country, the gains remain very limited. Taliban continue to tax the population and have actually increased the rate of taxations and the activities, the range of activities that they task. They've improved tax collections. They have centralized revenue now that they don't have to. I mean, the rule in the country is much more unified. It used to be much fragmented. Taliban and the government and many other actors took a share. Now Taliban have streamlined a little bit more. And there are activities going on due to the fact that there is still humanitarian assistance going to the country, and the fact that the Afghan private sector is operating, at least on a regional level, even though their access beyond Afghanistan has been much more curtailed due to the sanctions. And the Taliban are extracting a share of it as the kind of the ruling authority. Would Taliban make major changes to achieve political stability, to achieve recognition, to bottom line make Afghanistan a place where people would not feel horrible to be associated with, if they are investors, if they are talent that is trying to choose where to go, would require a kind of a fundamental change in the way the Taliban, I think, run the country. In absence of those, the prospect of economic growth or stabilization for a population of 40 million people, half of which are basically young people, teenagers, even like 14 and 50, below 14 and 15 years of age, and annually like a large number of them, 1 million people are entering the workforce. So there has to be like 1 million job created annually just to keep the current level of employment, which seems very, very difficult to do. So in absence of that fundamental change in the way they're operating, they can make certain gains here and there, basically taking advantage of the fact that they are the only ruling entity, taking some benefit from the peace dividend, the fact that there is no major hostility going on in the country, taking advantage of the fact that Afghanistan still is in a neighborhood where there are neighbors who have reasons to cooperate on issues of energy, water management, and such. But it's not going to be a game changer, and it's not going to be turning Afghanistan into, I don't know, China, UAE model of development. It's just going to be maybe enough to survive the regime and continue the status quo, which is, I think many have accurately phrased it as basically a famine equilibrium, which there's always a need for international assistance for the people to actually survive. And we're not talking about growth, really. We're just talking about stabilization.
What I just want to add to Haroun's points is that the economic openness and economic engagement and economic growth, that revenue for the Taliban, it's more so for regime survival. It's for their own enrichment as opposed to the benefit of the people. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because they're not accountable to the people. This is a regime that rules through fear and through no representation, and it's instructive for them to attract that foreign capital or even domestic capital as a way to establish themselves more strongly. So economically speaking, their economic objective is for their number one, regime survival, regime entrenchment, as opposed to providing the people with economic opportunities for growth and welfare. Where their to some extent, they are open, of course, because you have NGOs that are participating in the country that are providing basic services. They're okay for that to be outsourced. And that's to keep it at a bare minimum level as well. They have no problem with people suffering. They don't. And it's not seen as a responsibility for them to go in and to provide services because they ideologically are not positioned that way. So attracting economic growth is going to be beneficial for their own regime's survival and resentment, as opposed to it seen as a springboard through which they can provide those benefits to the broader population.
All right, so I just want to say, I'm going to ask one last question. You've been very, very generous with your time and your knowledge, and I want to thank all three panelists for what has been a phenomenal conversation. I've learned a great deal myself. I'm sure the audience has as well. So my final question is simply this. We did a 3 years outlook since the fall of Kabul. If you were gracious enough to give us your time again in 3 years, realistically, where do we think Afghanistan is vis-a-vis governance, vis-a-vis its position in the world 3 years from now, based on your read of the situation?
So it is very hard to predict, obviously, and as the saying goes, it's a difficult job to predict what's going to happen in Afghanistan. But the things I would watch is how do Taliban manage the growing grievances of different communities in Afghanistan? Will they become responsive to some of the basic needs of the population on the governance level, which means more inclusivity for the local voices in terms of matters that affect their lives, but also on issues of women's rights and others? Will they crack down on all spaces, basically suffocating and taking oxygen out of all the avenues that reduce the pressure as the population tries to survive under the Taliban rule? That would be one area to look at. There are some indications that Taliban may go either way. We don't really know what is going to be the general trajectory. The trajectory so far is negative, but it could change. For example, the UN Secretary General talked about how the Taliban are trying to reach out to the population more to, in their own words, reduce the distance between their government and the people. So I think they appreciate the need, how much they're willing to go, how far they're willing to go, and how much they can actually be responsive and square the people's popular demands with their kind of uncompromising ideological stance that are not popular, but still satisfy the core ideological tenets of the movement. That's one area to see. I hope that the trend would turn positive, but I don't have reasons to think that at the moment. The other issue would be just external environment. Pakistan has, as one of the countries to take in the neighborhood, has floated the idea that it could use armed actors against the Taliban in the country, and Taliban have accused Taliban to do that to do it now. Even up to now. And so the kind of proxy warfare that could go on in the region as a way to pressure the Taliban to be more responsive to the demands of these external actors. How those negotiations go, Taliban going to be able to reach some sort of agreements with the neighboring countries as a way to satisfy their security concerns, and in a way that would not lead to internal fragmentation of the movement and would not turn like a major ally into their enemy, opening a new front for them to deal with. For example, if TTP feels that it's been pressured too much and maybe even turn some of its focus towards Afghanistan Taliban. That will be one area to look at. And lastly, just the world, the broader terrorist landscape. There are many groups in the country, some of them anti-Taliban, many of them pro-Taliban and friendly with the Taliban. What they do and how Taliban can contain their ambitions and prevent them from planning attacks, executing attacks outside Afghanistan, which is their core mission. I mean, many of them are in Afghanistan, but obviously their objectives go beyond Afghanistan. How Taliban manage them and prevent them from actually doing something outside the country that complicates even further the Taliban relationship with the world. That will be like a third area to look at. it depends how those three different kind of set of factors play out. It could be that we will be talking about Afghanistan that is a path towards some sort of change that would reduce the likelihood of the repeat of conflict in the country and some sort of violent overturn of political system. Or it could be that 3 years from now, we'll be talking about another political turnover that is underway, or it's imminent, or is expected.
I think for me, as Haroun said, it's to be in the business of predicting anything to do with Afghanistan or any other country is very difficult. So I'm going to step away from that. But for me, the 3 areas that I would look to, one would be the coercive control of the state and what levers they use as a way to continue exerting that control within the country. So to what extent are they using their military forces, their intelligence forces, and so on as a way to exert control over the country? And the more that is being used, why is that being used? Is it being used to suppress dissent? Is it a way to further consolidate their control of the state because of the direction the state is going in and the way that they want to impose that control over the general population? Is it due to greater resistance that's occurring? So we need to also understand the underlying reasons as to if they were to exercise more coercive control of the general population, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and the likely impact of it. That would be the first area. The second area that I would be focusing on is to look at the shifting terrorism landscape, and we've talked about it in a few instances today. The area that I would be wanting to look at is the regional linkages, because the country is a home to a range of different terrorist organizations. And the point that I made was that they're not going to simply disarm and demobilize and reintegrate and not do anything about it. But the question is, to what extent are they going to link up with their peers across other borders? And we've seen, at least in the case of ISKP, the lethality with which they've been able to conduct some attacks in Iran and more recently in Moscow. So there is going to be that instance. There might be those instances where these groups, as domestic dynamics are shifting alongside external dynamics are shifting, how they interact with one another, and perhaps the space and opportunities that these groups within Afghanistan may find with their peers outside of Afghanistan, and what they are able to do by collaborating. So that shifting terrorism landscape along the regional lens, and where they may be seeking targeting opportunities, would that be against Central Asian interests or Western interests in Central Asia and beyond? So there's a very long menu of potential targets, obviously. So we'd want to watch this shifting terrorism landscape in Afghanistan. The third area I would see is that this is the very unpredictable one, which is these black swan events. Over the everybody has been reading about the sudden the helicopter crash which killed the Iranian president and the foreign minister. And so there can be instances even within Afghanistan where you have events that can cause significant political disruption. Now, it would be to what extent are the Taliban resilient enough as maintaining that internal cohesion to survive possible, the Akhundzada, we find out one fine day he's dead or has been dead for some time, and there could be a leadership struggle within the country and certain factions then pushing for power, and what that would mean for the internal cohesion of the country, but also perhaps fault lines being exposed and then being exploited, both from within and outside. Pakistan is likely to exploit them, so is Iran. They have different reasons for doing so, and we can talk about that in another session. But it's very unpredictable, the landscape, just as we saw over the weekend, where you could have a very strong security apparatus, and something as incremental as weather could have a very big impact. Of course, Iran is no Afghanistan and vice versa, but these are factors that we have to think about because they buck the so-called trend analysis that we're doing. Thank you.
So, panelists, gentlemen, you cannot hear us clap in this format, but I guarantee you there's lots of people who joined you who are clapping. I won't use my big hands to make the noise for all of us, but thank you very, very much to both of you and to Fereshta for your time. This has been phenomenal. Thank you, audience, for joining us, and I hope we do something similar again soon. when we have a chance. Thank you very, very much, all.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for this opportunity. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care. Likewise.